Hi, I'm David Miller, here with the second in a series of 7 mini-lectures on Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here are the titles of all 7 mini-lectures. I said last time that we'd look at reflections of Queen Elizabeth in the play. The title of this mini-lecture, Like to a Dowager, offers the first such reflection of the Queen. Here's a simple outline of the topics for this mini-lecture. Let's start with a closer look at the play's opening lines. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon. But oh, methinks, how slow this old moon wanes. She lingers my desires, like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue. 4 days will quickly steep themselves in night. 4 nights will quickly dream away the time, and then the moon, like to a silver bow new bent in heaven, shall behold the night of our solemnities. Duke Theseus is eagerly anticipating his marriage to Hippolyta, complaining that the old moon lingers his desires, like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue. The moon, as literary symbol at this time, was directly associated with Queen Elizabeth because she was praised as a virgin goddess. The names of the classical lunar deities, Cynthia and Diana, were commonly used in complimentary references to the Queen. Here, though, there's a twist. The OED defines dowager as a woman whose husband is dead and who is in the enjoyment of some title or property that has come to her from him, often added to the title so enjoyed as Princess Dowager, Queen Dowager, Dowager Duchess, Dowager Queen, Dowager Lady, etc. The dictionary adds that the term seems to have been first used for Elizabeth's aunt Mary Tudor, the Dowager Queen of France. So this female figure, a stepmother or widow, has gotten her authority and property from a deceased male. For Elizabeth, that would be her father, not a husband, and she's living too long, keeping her male heir waiting for his inheritance. In other words, the opening lines of the play mirror precisely the national mood in England in 1595. Elizabeth has been on the throne for more than 35 years. The court and the ranks of the aristocracy are filled with men who have grown old, waiting for promotions that never arrived, waiting for a royal marriage that never took place to provide them with a king. Notice how Hippolyta replies, though. She sees the moon very differently. To her, it's a weapon, a silver bow new bent in heaven. The lunar goddess Diana, in classical mythology, is both a virgin and a huntress. If this is her bow, it might well be threatening the solemnities it looks down on. This is all the more likely if you recall that Hippolyta herself is a conquered Amazon. It's her bow, too, and might be taken to imply that Theseus, having wooed her with his sword, hasn't conquered quite all resistance. And of course, the image ties the notion of a resistant Hippolyta back to Queen Elizabeth. As a symbol of English military power, the Queen was represented as an Amazon. For instance, in this Dutch engraving, which represents England in the person of Elizabeth with her sword arm raised. Or in this engraving by Thomas Cecil, in which an armed Elizabeth on horseback receives a lance from the allegorical figure of Truth, while the Spanish Armada goes down to defeat in the background. So right from the start, the play gives us a double vision of the Queen and the question of female subordination within marriage. One reference is hostile, the other favorable. Her presence cuts both ways, like that sword she wields in the Dutch engraving. Elizabeth is a powerful figure, the one thing both dowagers and Amazons have in common, but one who evokes deeply conflicted feelings. Where else does she turn up in Shakespeare's play? Well, the opening lines we have been looking at are followed at once by a scene of forced marriage and resistance as Aegeus bursts in with his daughter Hermia in tow. All the hints and undertones of those opening lines suddenly turn into the central dramatic conflict unfolding before us. After the older generation have left the stage, Lysander and Hermia plan their escape. Lysander mentions that he has a widowette, a dowager of great revenue, and she hath no child, and she respects me as her only son. From Athens is her house remote 7 leagues. There, gentle Hermia, I may marry thee. The verbal echo of Theseus' lines is unmistakable, but notice that the associations have been reversed. This dowager offers her revenue instead of withering it out. Elizabeth's failure to provide an heir to the throne was a source of widespread anxiety in England, but this dowager's lack of an heir means Lysander is in for a nice inheritance, and her house, 7 leagues from Athens, looks like an alternative center of power, where the patriarchal law of Theseus and Aegeus cannot pursue the young lovers. Unlike Hippolyta, this dowager hasn't been conquered by Theseus, and is therefore able to sponsor Hermia's resistance to her father. This is a far more wishful image of Queen Elizabeth, don't you agree? If only she would gratify her adopted sons in this way, they wouldn't all feel so much like Theseus. These references are indirect, although they'd have been fairly obvious to Shakespeare's contemporaries. They are just veiled enough to keep the theater company, the Lord Chamberlain's men, from getting into trouble. The theater company depended on royal patronage to keep the City of London from shutting down the theaters. The merchants didn't like the competition for business on weekends. That's one reason for all the hints and nuances in the opening scene. But as we approach the forest, the political references become more explicit, and for this reason have to be carefully qualified. Shakespeare is going to evoke some really scandalous fantasies about the Queen. How does he get away with that? One way he gets away with it is by misdirection, like a magician. There's a speech early in Act 2 in which Oberon explains to Puck the origins of the magic juice that causes instant infatuation. He tells Puck that he saw Cupid flying between the cold moon and the earth take aim against a fair vestal throned by the west. But Cupid's shaft was quenched in the chaste beams of the watery moon, and so the imperial votress passed on, untouched, while the arrow fell instead on a little western flower, whose color changed from white to purple with love's wound. The flower is clearly a female symbol here, just as Cupid's love shaft is sexually male. But notice that the deflowered flower, purple with love's wound, also distills into its juice the power of the shaft that wounds it, and so the flower effectively substitutes for Cupid's arrow in the action of the play. This passage makes a great show of flourishing Queen Elizabeth's combination of power with virginity. It starts out with the familiar image of the moon as sexually cold and high above the earth, then introduces the fair vestal, a virgin but also a priestess whose virginity is therefore sacred, who is described as throned by the west, clearly the Virgin Queen of England. She passes on fancy-free, a phrase that means her fantasies are not fixed on a love object, not controlled by any external power. In this, she is utterly unlike the other women in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, as an exercise in explicit praise of the Queen, the passage is respectful, even celebratory. The images it employs were familiar as courtly compliments to Elizabeth. She did have many suitors, and at times seemed close to marrying, but Cupid's arrow always just missed. For those who wanted their queen to wed and provide an heir to the throne, the complimentary tone is therefore tinged with regret. The dominant tone of the passage is celebration, but a trace of the ambivalence we see elsewhere in the play may be detected here as well. Of course, the most prominent victim of Oberon's flower power is his own queen, Titania, who has just pretty emphatically declined to submit to him. He may celebrate the image of a Vestal queen passing on fancy-free, but he isn't about to celebrate female freedom in his own domain. And so the ambivalence that is mostly deflected like Cupid's arrow from the imperial votress comes roaring back, or perhaps we should say braying back, in a comic tale of bestiality used to humiliate a resisting queen. That's where the place treatment of Elizabeth gets really dicey. We'll talk more about it next time. For now, let me just conclude by answering the question I asked earlier. How does Shakespeare get away with this? I said he uses misdirection. The explicit tribute to Elizabeth draws suspicion away from Titania as a figure of the queen, even though the Fairy Queen was the most famous of her literary names. 5 years before Shakespeare wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream, Edmund Spenser published the first installment of a vast allegorical romance called The Fairy Queen, dedicated to Elizabeth. In a letter published with the first edition, the poet identifies Queen Elizabeth explicitly with Gloriana, his name for the Queen of Fairies. This was the most celebrated poem of the Elizabethan era, and Spenser was the most respected poet, hailed on his monument in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey as the Prince of Poets in his time. Shakespeare, therefore, is pulling off a very complicated maneuver, not only giving his audiences a spectacularly disrespectful and therefore deeply satisfying image of their queen, but at the same time stealing the thunder of the most famous English poet of the day. Talk about your double-edged sword.